The late afternoon sun hung low over the sprawling countryside, casting long, golden shadows across the manicured lawns of the Sterling estate. It was the kind of place that screamed money, even from a distance, the kind of quiet, polished wealth that usually went undisturbed. But today, the calm was broken by the rhythmic clatter of horse hooves and the heavy crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel driveway. Inside the main house, the air was thick with nervous energy. Mr. Sterling, the owner of the estate, was pacing back and forth in the entrance hall, adjusting his cufflinks for the 10th time. He wasn't waiting for just any guest, he was waiting for Signor Valerio, a pianist and conductor known across the continent as a genius, but feared as a tyrant. When the carriage finally pulled to a stop, the servants scrambled to their positions. The door swung open, and Valerio stepped out. He was a tall, thin man with a face like a hawk, sharp and observant. He was dressed in a tailored black coat that seemed to repel the dust of the road, and he carried himself with an air that suggested he believed the world existed solely for his amusement. He didn't look at the beautiful landscape or the grand house, he simply looked at his pocket watch, clicked his tongue in impatience, and marched toward the front door. Mr. Sterling rushed out to greet him, his smile a little too wide and his voice a little too loud. "Signor Valerio. Welcome. It is the greatest honor to have you here," Sterling gushed, extending a hand. Valerio looked at the hand for a fraction of a second before offering a limp, brief shake. "Yes, yes." The journey was interminable, Valerio said, his voice smooth but cold. "I hope the accommodations are tolerable. I require silence for my art. The city noise is bad enough, I cannot abide by country chaos." Of course. Everything is arranged," Sterling assured him, leading the Maestro inside. As they walked into the grand drawing room, Valerio's eyes swept over the decor like a critic looking for flaws. He touched the velvet curtains, rubbed a finger along a shelf to check for dust, and finally, his gaze landed on the centerpiece of the room, a grand piano made of dark, polished mahogany. It was a magnificent instrument, bought by Sterling specifically for this visit. Valerio walked toward it, but he didn't sit down immediately. He circled it, inspecting it as one might inspect a horse they were considering buying. He lifted the fall board, revealing the black and white keys. For a moment, the room held its breath. The servants, standing in the corners, peeked out from behind doorways. They all expected a beautiful melody to fill the room. Instead, Valerio struck a single, harsh chord. He let the sound hang in the air, listening intently, his nose wrinkled in disgust. He slammed the fallboard shut with a loud bang that made Mrs. Sterling jump in her chair. "The humidity," Valerio sighed, shaking his head. "It is ruinous to the tone. The sound is thick, stagnant, like the air in this village." He turned away from the piano, treating the instrument with the same disdain he showed the road. He walked to the window and looked out at the fields. In the distance, he could see farm workers heading home for the day. He watched them for a moment, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Do you know what the tragedy of the countryside is, my dear Sterling?" Valerio asked, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "It is the waste of potential. Look at them. Simple people living simple lives. They breathe the same air as we do, eat the same food, yet they are hollow. They have no soul for art. They work like oxen and sleep like dogs. To think that one of them might appreciate the sublime nuances of a Rachmaninoff concerto is laughable." Mr. Sterling laughed nervously, not wanting to offend his guest, though he felt a pang of guilt knowing many of those workers were his neighbors. "Oh, certainly, Signor. The common folk have their own concerns, of course. Concerns? Valerio scoffed, pouring himself a glass of wine without waiting for the butler. They have concerns about mud and rain and crops. They have no capacity for beauty. True music, the kind I created, requires intellect, refinement, breeding. It is not for the muddy hands of a peasant. He took a sip of wine and swirled it around the glass, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at his own pristine hands. I am a surgeon with sound, he continued, his voice rising with his own ego. I operate on the emotions. But one cannot operate on a stone. These country people are stones. They feel nothing. They are deaf to the divine. The servants in the room exchanged glances. They were used to guests being rude, but there was something particularly biting about the way Valerio spoke. It wasn't just that he thought he was better, he truly believed that everyone else was barely human. He didn't see people, he saw an audience that existed only to applaud him, or a background that existed only to serve him. The evening wore on, and dinner was a tense affair. Valerio dominated the conversation, speaking only of his own performances in the great capitals of Europe, of the kings and queens who had bowed to him, and of the critics who had wept at his playing. Whenever someone else tried to speak, he would talk over them, his voice silencing the table like a whip crack. By the time the dessert was served, the atmosphere in the house was heavy. The Sterlings were exhausted from trying to keep him happy, and the staff was tense from his sharp orders. Yet, the Maestro seemed satisfied. He believed he had thoroughly established his dominance over the house and the region. He had made it clear that he was the superior being in this rural setting. He finished his meal, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and stood up abruptly. I shall retire, he announced. I must rest my fingers. I have done enough talking for one evening. He paused at the doorway, looking back at the Sterlings with a patronizing smile. Do ensure there are no disturbances in the morning. I require absolute focus. I intend to play tomorrow, and I will not have the clatter of the house breaking my concentration. With that, he swept out of the room, leaving the family in silence. They sat there for a moment, listening to his footsteps echoing up the stairs, growing fainter until they disappeared. The house felt empty and cold. It was clear that while Signor Valerio was a guest in their home, he had brought no joy with him, only a shadow of arrogance that seemed to darken every corner of the estate. No one knew it yet, but the stage was set. The Maestro had spoken too soon, and his judgment of the muddy hands and the simple folk was about to collide with a reality he never saw coming. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees that shadowed the workers' cottages, unaware of the shock that was waiting just around the corner. The morning sun had barely crested the hills, but the Sterling estate was already awake with a different kind of energy. The previous night's tension lingered in the hallways like a bad smell. The servants moved quietly, terrified of making a sound that might disturb the great artist sleeping upstairs. Signor Valerio had made it clear that his rest was sacred, and the staff walked on eggshells, afraid that a creaky floorboard or a clattering pot might bring his wrath down upon them. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was busy but hushed. It was here that Martha arrived. She was the wife of Thomas, the estate's head groundskeeper. Martha was not a servant of the main house, but she often came by in the mornings to drop off fresh vegetables, eggs, or flowers from their own small cottage garden. She was a sturdy woman in her late 40s, with hair the color of dried straw pulled back into a tight, practical bun. Her face was weathered from years of working in the sun and wind, and her clothes were simple, clean, and worn a heavy cotton skirt and a thick shawl despite the warmth of the morning. She placed a heavy basket of fresh apples on the large wooden table in the scullery. The cook, a kind woman named Mrs. Higgins, smiled at her gratefully. "Thank you, Martha. These look perfect," Mrs. Higgins whispered. "Mr. Sterling wants these for the guests' breakfast." Martha nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. She was about to leave, to go back to the quiet safety of her garden, when she heard it. A faint sound drifted from the hallway leading to the drawing room. It was the sound of a piano key being struck, then another, soft and deliberate. Martha froze. She knew that sound well. In her youth, before the hard years of farming life took over, she had loved music. But that was a lifetime ago. Curiosity got the better of her. She stepped out of the kitchen and moved toward the open doors of the drawing room. The room was empty. The housekeeper had just finished cleaning, and the morning light was flooding in, illuminating the grand mahogany piano. It sat there like a sleeping beast. Martha stood in the doorway, her basket forgotten in her hands. She felt a pull she hadn't felt in years. Her feet moved almost on their own, carrying her across the plush carpet until she stood right in front of the instrument. It was beautiful. The wood gleamed, and the keys looked like white ivory teeth. Martha reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She wanted to touch it, just once, to feel the coolness of the ivory under her fingertips. She didn't dare play it, she knew her place. But she just wanted to feel the connection, to remember the days when her hands were soft and her dreams were big. "Careful." The sharp, sarcastic voice cut through the silence like a knife. Martha snatched her hand back as if she had been burned. She spun around to see Signor Valerio standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a silk robe, holding a cup of coffee, looking at her with a mixture of amusement and disgust. Behind him, Mrs. Sterling and the housekeeper appeared, drawn by the noise. They looked nervous. I'm sorry, sir," Martha stammered, dropping into a clumsy curtsy. "I was just looking. I didn't mean to touch." Valerio stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on Martha. He walked around her slowly, like a wolf circling a sheep. He took a sip of his coffee, then let out a loud, theatrical sigh. "Looking," he repeated, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Looking at what, the piano, or were you planning to play a concerto for us?" The housekeeper and Mrs. Sterling looked down, uncomfortable. Valerio, however, was enjoying himself. He loved an audience, even a small, reluctant one. He pointed a manicured finger at Martha. "Look at her, everyone," he announced. "This is the local talent, I presume the soul of the countryside." Martha blushed, her cheeks burning hot. She tried to step back toward the door, but he blocked her path with a graceful movement. No, don't run away," Valerio laughed. "Please. Tell me, what were you thinking? Did you think that because no one was watching, you could unleash the genius within?" He reached out and grabbed Martha's rough, calloused hand. He held it up in the air, displaying it to the room. Martha felt humiliated. She tried to pull away, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "Look at these hands!" he cried out. "Do you see these, Mrs. Sterling? Look at the dirt under the nails. Look at the skin, tough as leather. These are hands that pull weeds, that dig in the mud, that scrub floors. These are not hands that make music." He dropped her hand as if it were dirty. Martha held her hand against her chest, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She wanted to run, but her feet felt heavy. "A piano is a delicate instrument," Valerio continued, pacing back and forth. "It responds to the slightest touch. It requires sensitivity, nuance, elegance. If a creature like this were to touch the keys, she would likely break them. She would treat a Beethoven sonata like she was threshing wheat. The maestro chuckled darkly. I find it insulting, actually, that a person of this standing, with no education, no refinement, no class, would believe for even a second that she could understand the language of the gods. It is cute, really. Like a dog trying to walk on its hind legs. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mrs. Sterling cleared her throat, wanting to say something to stop him, but she was afraid of offending her famous guest. Now, Signor, Mrs. Sterling said weakly. Martha is a good woman. She just helps us with the garden. A good woman for digging potatoes, perhaps, Valerio sneered. But not for art. There is a ceiling in this world, madam. Some of us are born to soar, and others are born to walk the earth. It is the natural order. He turned his cold eyes back to Martha. He leaned in close, so only she could hear, though his voice was still loud enough for the others to catch the gist. Do us all a favor, my dear. Go back to your mud. Leave the beauty to those who can appreciate it. You look at that piano like a starving child looks at bread, but you must realize, you will never get a taste. He turned his back on her, dismissing her completely, expecting her to scurry away in shame. And normally, Martha would have. She was a simple woman who avoided conflict. But as she stood there, looking at his arrogant back, something shifted inside her. She looked at the piano again. Then she looked at her hands, the hands he had mocked, the hands that had worked so hard her entire life. She didn't run. She stood her ground, her back straightening. She didn't know where the courage came from, but the look in her eyes changed from fear to a quiet, steely resolve. The air in the room seemed to change, thickening with anticipation. The mockery hung heavy in the air, but Martha refused to let it choke her. Signor Valerio turned around, expecting to find the doorway empty. Instead, he found Martha still standing there, looking at him. He frowned, annoyed that his victim hadn't fled. Why are you still here? He snapped. Did you not understand me? I said you are dismissed. Martha took a small breath. She didn't look at Mrs. Sterling or the housekeeper. She kept her eyes locked on the maestro. I understand you, sir, Martha said, her voice steady and surprisingly strong. You think my hands are too dirty to make something beautiful. Valerio laughed, throwing his head back. It is not an opinion, my dear woman. It is a fact. Maybe, Martha said softly. But maybe dirt isn't the only thing that comes off them. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of suspense. Mrs. Sterling stepped forward, her eyes wide. She sensed that something was about to happen, something she couldn't control. Martha, she whispered. Perhaps you should go. But it was too late. The challenge had been issued, not with words, but with the way Martha stood there, unshakable. Valerio sensed it too. His eyes narrowed. He felt his authority being threatened, not by a rival musician, but by a farmer's wife. It was absurd. It was insulting. And yet, he was intrigued to see how far this foolishness would go. He crossed his arms, a cruel smirk returning to his face. Very well, he said. You have spirit, I will give you that. Foolish, ignorant spirit, but spirit nonetheless. He walked to the piano and swept his arm across it, presenting it to her like a king presenting a chopping block. Go on then, he taunted. Show us. Humor us. Play a chord. Let us hear what a farmer's hands can do. Give me a reason to laugh today. Martha looked at the keys, then back at the man who had humiliated her. She knew she was taking a risk. She knew she was making a scene. But as she walked toward the piano bench, the fear fell away, replaced by a lifetime of unspoken melody. She didn't sit down like a novice, she sat down with the gravity of a queen taking her throne. She placed her rough, calloused fingers on the pristine white keys, and for the first time, Signor Valerio stopped smiling. The drawing room was so quiet that the silence felt heavy, pressing against everyone's ears. It was the kind of silence that happens when a large group of people hold their breath all at once. Signor Valerio was leaning casually against the fireplace mantel, his arms crossed over his chest. He had a look on his face that was cruel and expectant, like a child waiting for a bug to squash. He was certain this was going to be the funniest part of his day. To him, this wasn't a concert, it was a comedy show, and the farmer's wife was the clown. Mrs. Sterling stood near the door, twisting her handkerchief nervously. She wanted to stop this, to tell Martha to just go home and spare herself the embarrassment, but she was frozen. The sheer confidence of the maestro was overwhelming. Even the servants had stopped peeking through the cracks in the door, they were standing just out of sight, listening, wondering what on earth was happening. Go on, then, Valerio said, his voice light and mocking. He waved one hand in the air as if he was shooing away a fly. Don't keep us in suspense. Play something simple. Perhaps a nursery rhyme. Mary had a little lamb that should be within your capabilities. Do try not to break the keys with your fists. A few nervous titters escaped from the guests who had gathered in the hallway to watch. They were uncomfortable, but social pressure forced them to laugh along with the powerful man. Martha did not move. She sat on the bench, her back to the audience, looking at the rows of black and white keys. Her hands were resting on her lap. To anyone watching, she looked small and defeated. Her shoulders were slumped, and her worn dress looked out of place in the elegant room. Valerio sighed loudly, rolling his eyes toward the ceiling. I see the stage fright has taken hold, he announced to the room. It is common among those with small minds. They freeze when faced with greatness. But Martha wasn't freezing in fear. She was praying. She wasn't saying words, but she was sending a silent wish to the heavens. She closed her eyes for a long moment and blocked out the sound of Valerio's breathing, the smell of his expensive cologne, and the arrogance that filled the room. She thought back to when she was a little girl. She thought about the old, beat-up piano her teacher had owned. She thought about the music that had lived in her heart for 30 years, music that had no place to go because she was too busy feeding her family and working the land. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were rough. The skin was thick, the knuckles were swollen, and there were scars from thorns and tools. Valerio saw ugliness when he looked at them. But Martha saw strength. She saw hands that had planted seeds that grew into food. She saw hands that had held her children when they were sick. These were not hands that destroyed, they were hands that created. She realized, in that moment, that beauty didn't come from soft skin. Beauty came from the soul that drove the hands. Slowly, deliberately, Martha reached out and placed her fingers on the keys. She didn't just mash them down. She positioned her hands with a care that surprised everyone watching. She adjusted her posture, sitting up straight, and she shifted the piano bench slightly to get the right height. Valerio let out a sharp, barking laugh. Look at that. She is adjusting the bench. How adorable. She thinks posture matters when one has no talent. The laughter in the room grew a little louder. They thought she was pretending to be a lady. Martha ignored them. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of the room that she had cleaned 100 times. She felt the vibration of the wood beneath her fingertips. She was no longer a servant or a farmer's wife. In that moment, she was a musician. She was a conduit for something bigger than herself, bigger than Valerio, bigger than the estate. She pressed down the first chord. It wasn't a clumsy thump. It wasn't a single note. It was a full, resonant C minor chord that rang out through the room like a clap of thunder. The sound was so rich and so perfectly balanced that the laughter in the room died instantly. It was as if someone had suddenly turned off a radio. The chord hung in the air, vibrating against the crystal glasses on the table and the gold frames on the mirrors. Valerio's smirk faltered. He blinked, his body stiffening against the mantelpiece. He knew that sound. That wasn't the sound of a beginner hitting lucky notes. That was the sound of intention. Before anyone could recover from the shock of that first sound, Martha moved her hands. She didn't play Mary Had a Little Lamb. She launched into the opening bars of a stormy, difficult Beethoven sonata, the Pathetic. Her left hand began a heavy, rhythmic bass line, marching like soldiers, while her right hand spun out a melody that was sad, angry, and beautiful all at once. The speed of her playing was shocking. Her fingers, which Valerio had mocked as clumsy, flew across the keys with a blur of motion. They were not soft, delicate hands, but they were strong. They had the strength of a woman who had spent decades digging in the earth, and now that strength was being used to tame the beast of a piano. The room was transformed. The dusty, arrogant atmosphere vanished, replaced by a raw, emotional power. Martha played with a kind of aggression that Valerio, with all his technical perfection, never had. She didn't just play the notes on the page, she poured her life into them. You could hear the wind in the wheat fields in the high notes, and the rumble of thunder in the low notes. She was telling a story, the story of every hard day she had ever worked, every sorrow she had ever buried, and every dream she had ever given up. Mrs. Sterling took a step closer to the door, her hand over her mouth. She wasn't looking at the piano, she was looking at Martha. The woman sitting there seemed to have grown 2 inches. Her back was rigid, her head bowed slightly in concentration. She looked fierce. Valerio pushed himself away from the fireplace. He stood up straight, the glass of wine forgotten on the mantel. The color drained from his face. He walked slowly toward the piano, his eyes narrowing. He was looking for the trick. He was convinced that this couldn't be real. He expected her to mess up, to lose the rhythm, to crash into a wrong chord. But she didn't. She navigated the difficult runs and jumps with an accuracy that was terrifying. She hit a series of fast, descending notes, a waterfall of sound that cascaded down the keyboard. Her calloused fingertips didn't slip, they struck the keys with a percussive force that made the piano sing. It was a sound full of grit and dirt and honesty. It was the opposite of the polished, empty music Valerio played. This music had blood in it. The guests in the hallway stopped whispering. They stopped judging her clothes and her hands. They were captivated. Music is a universal language, and even people who knew nothing about pianos could tell that this was extraordinary. They were witnessing a transformation that defied logic. The humble woman they ignored was commanding the room with an iron will. Martha's eyes were closed now. She wasn't in the drawing room anymore. She was far away, riding the music like a wild horse. She could feel the vibrations traveling up her arms, shaking away the years of silence. She remembered the teacher who told her she was good, the life she might have had if she had been born rich. But as she played, the regret vanished. She realized she didn't need his approval anymore. She didn't need his polite applause. She had this. She had this moment. As the music built toward a loud, crashing crescendo, Valerio finally stopped walking. He stood about 10 feet away from her, his mouth slightly open. He looked at her hands, those muddy hands he had despised, and he saw them doing something he couldn't do. They were playing with the soul he had lost years ago. He looked small standing there in his expensive silk robe, while Martha in her simple cotton dress filled the entire house with sound. The tables had turned, and the maestro was finally beginning to understand that he wasn't the master of the house anymore. The music was in charge now, and the music was coming from a place he never expected. The music didn't just stay loud, it began to breathe. After the storm of the opening notes, the song shifted. The heavy, crashing chords melted away into a soft, singing melody that floated through the room like a ribbon of smoke. It was a gentle, heartbreaking tune that seemed to echo the loneliness of the countryside at dusk. Martha's hands, which had been striking the keys like hammer blows just moments before, suddenly became incredibly gentle. She caressed the ivory, her rough fingertips coaxing a sound out of the piano that was impossibly sweet. It was a paradox that the room struggled to understand. How could hands that looked like they belonged holding a shovel create something so delicate? It was like watching a blacksmith weave lace. The guests standing in the hallway had completely forgotten their manners. They were no longer peeking around corners, they were standing in the open, their mouths slightly agape. The air of superiority they had carried into the house that morning had evaporated. They weren't seeing a farmer's wife anymore. They were seeing a woman bearing her soul. The music felt honest. It wasn't polished or shiny like the music they heard in fancy concert halls, it was raw. It sounded like real life, full of joy one moment and deep sadness the next. Mrs. Sterling felt tears pricking her eyes. She looked at her husband, and saw that he was equally transfixed. They had spent a fortune bringing the best musicians to their estate, men and women who played with perfect technique, but none of them had ever made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up like this. Martha wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just playing. But the most profound change was happening to Signor Valerio. He had moved from his spot by the fireplace and was now standing just a few feet behind Martha. His face was a mask of confusion. He was a man who prided himself on knowing everything about music. He knew the history, the theory, the technique. He had spent a lifetime studying how to move his fingers perfectly, yet, as he watched Martha, he realized she was breaking all the rules he held sacred. Her posture wasn't textbook. Her technique wasn't what the masters in Vienna taught. But the sound was undeniable. She was playing with a passion that Valerio had lost years ago. He played to impress kings and queens, she played as if her life depended on it. He watched her calloused fingers flying across the keys, doing things he didn't think were possible for someone without training. He looked closely at her hands. He saw the scars, the swollen joints, the dirt embedded in the lines of her palms. Suddenly, he didn't see ugliness anymore. He saw history. He saw years of labor. And he realized that all that hardness in her life was being poured into the music, giving it a weight and a power that his soft, privileged hands could never replicate. The music began to rise again, climbing back up toward the stormy heights. The tempo increased, and Martha's body swayed with the rhythm. She was sweating now, a bead of perspiration rolling down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. She was completely lost in the world of the song. She wasn't thinking about the Maestro, the Sterlings, or the humiliation she had suffered earlier. She was free. In that moment, the piano was her escape, her voice, and her weapon all at once. The room vibrated with the intensity of the climax. The notes cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall of emotion, fast and furious. It was a musical declaration of strength. The listeners felt like they were being swept away by a river. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. Valerio felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightening. It was jealousy, yes, but it was also something he hadn't felt in a long time, humility. He realized that while he had spent his life looking down on people like Martha, she had possessed a gift that all his money and status couldn't buy. He thought he was the teacher and the world was full of students, but standing there, listening to a farmer's wife play the heart out of a Beethoven sonata, he knew who the real master was. Martha hit the final run of notes, a flurry of sound that rushed toward the end like a train approaching a station. And then, with one decisive, powerful chord, she brought the song to a close. She slammed her hands down on the keys, holding the chord, letting the sound ring out and fill every corner of the vast room. It was a sound of defiance. It hung in the air, echoing off the high ceilings, shaking the crystal in the cabinets. Then, silence. Martha lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She sat there for a moment, her chest heaving, her eyes still closed, letting the reality of the room seep back in. The silence that followed wasn't the polite silence of a boring concert, it was a heavy, shocked silence. It was the silence of 100 people realizing they had been wrong about everything. No one spoke. No one moved. In the hallway, a servant dropped a silver tray, but no one even turned to look. The only sound was the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Sterling. The spell was cast, and the audience was bewitched. They didn't know what to do. Do they clap? Do they run away? Do they apologize? The social order had been shattered, and in its place was just a woman and a piano. Valerio stood frozen. He looked at the back of Martha's head. He opened his mouth to say something, to critique her, to find some flaw, to regain his control, but his voice failed him. There was nothing to say. The music had spoken louder than his insults ever could. The rough, muddy hands had done the impossible. They had shocked everyone. They had silenced the maestro. And as Martha finally opened her eyes and turned around on the bench to face the room, the expression on her face was not one of arrogance or victory. It was simple, quiet dignity. She had shown them who she was, without saying a single word. The silence in the drawing room didn't break right away. It stretched out, thick and heavy, wrapping around everyone like a blanket. The last vibrating string of the piano finally stopped humming, but the feeling of the music was still trapped in the walls. It was the kind of quiet that happens when people see something they can't explain. No one looked at each other. They all just stared at Martha, who sat with her hands resting in her lap, her head bowed. She looked small again, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the moment. It was Mrs. Sterling who finally moved. She let out a long, shaky breath that she seemed to have been holding for the entire song. Then, she stepped forward and began to clap. It wasn't the polite, slow clapping of a formal audience. It was a sharp, loud sound, like a crack in a dam. Almost immediately, the rest of the room followed. Mr. Sterling started clapping. The guests in the hallway surged forward, their hands coming together in a thunder of applause. Even the servants, who usually hid in the shadows, stepped out and clapped until their palms stung. The sound was overwhelming, filling the room with a chaotic joy that contrasted sharply with the ordered arrogance of just 10 minutes ago. But Martha didn't look up. She didn't take a bow or smile at the audience. In fact, she looked terrified. The attention felt like heat to her. She stood up quickly, knocking the bench back slightly with a screech that was lost in the noise. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous habit she had done 1,000 times before, but now it felt different. She wasn't wiping off dirt, she was wiping off the magic. She wanted to disappear. She felt like she had just run a marathon, and her legs were shaking. She turned to leave, keeping her eyes on the floor, desperate to escape to the safety of the kitchen or the garden. But as she hurried toward the door, a figure stepped into her path. It was Signor Valerio. The room went quiet again. The applause died down instantly as everyone watched to see what the maestro would do. Would he yell? Would he scold her for touching his instrument? Valerio stood still, blocking her exit. His face was pale. The cruel smirk was gone, erased completely. His eyes, which had been so full of mockery earlier, were now wide and wet. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or perhaps, a man who had just seen God. Martha stopped, shrinking back against the piano. She expected him to scold her. She expected him to demand she leave the house. "Signor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am sorry. I will go now." "Go?" Valerio asked. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "You cannot go." "Not yet." He reached out a hand, but he didn't grab her this time. He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air, unsure if he was worthy of touching her. Then, he gently took her calloused, rough hand in both of his soft, pale ones. He looked down at her fingers, turning them over, staring at the scars and the hardened skin as if they were precious jewels. "I have played in every royal court in Europe," Valerio said, speaking to her but loud enough for the room to hear. "I have played for emperors and queens. I have been called the greatest living musician. But I have never heard what I just heard." Martha looked up, surprised by the tears streaming down the old man's face. "You mocked me, sir," Martha said softly. "You said my hands were for digging." "And I was a fool," Valerio interrupted, his voice cracking with emotion. "A blind, arrogant fool. I thought music was about technique. I thought it was about clean fingers and expensive education. I was wrong." He squeezed her hand gently. "Music is about life. It is about suffering and joy. It is about the soul. And you, madam, you have a soul that sings louder than any orchestra I have ever conducted. Those hands." He lifted her hand slightly, showing it to the room. "These hands have worked. They have felt the earth. They know the weight of life. That is why your playing is so heavy, so beautiful. You did not play the notes. You played the truth." The room was dead silent. The guests were stunned. They had never seen the great Signor Valerio humble himself before anyone. But here he was, holding the hand of a farmer's wife, asking for forgiveness with his eyes. "I am ashamed," Valerio continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I judged the book by the cover, and I missed the greatest story inside. Can you ever forgive an old man his pride?" Martha looked at him. She saw the regret in his eyes. She saw that the cruelty had been stripped away, leaving only a lonely old man who finally understood. She didn't feel angry anymore. The music had taken the anger out of her. "There is nothing to forgive, sir," Martha said gently. "Music is for everyone. You just You just forgot that for a moment. Valerio let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He bowed low, not a theatrical stage bow, but a deep, respectful bow to Martha. When he straightened up, he stepped aside to let her pass. "Please," he said. "Go back to your life. But know this, you are a maestro, too. The truest kind." Martha didn't know what to say. She gave a small, awkward curtsy, then slipped past him. She walked through the crowd of guests, but they didn't look at her with amusement anymore. They parted like the Red Sea to let her through. Many of them had tears in their eyes. Some nodded their heads in respect. They saw her differently now. She wasn't just the help, she was the woman who had held the room in the palm of her hand. She walked out of the drawing room and into the hallway. She could still feel the vibrations of the piano in her fingertips. As she reached the back door, she stepped out into the cool morning air. The sun was bright now. She saw Thomas, her husband, working in the distance. She took a deep breath, smelling the dirt and the grass. She smiled. She was just Martha again. But she felt a little taller. Inside, the party eventually broke up. Signor Valerio refused to play for the guests that afternoon, or the next day. He said he couldn't bear to touch the keys after hearing what real music sounded like. He packed his bags early. When he said goodbye to the Sterlings, he was quieter, more thoughtful. He didn't brag about his concerts. He just shook their hands and left. As his carriage drove away, turning onto the long road that led out of the village, Valerio sat back against the seat. He looked out the window at the fields. He saw the farmers working. He saw the simple folk he had despised. But he didn't see oxen or stones anymore. He saw people with stories, with pain, and with hidden depths he would never understand. He closed his eyes and listened to the memory of the music made by the rough hands of a farmer's wife. It was the only music he wanted to hear. The story of that day spread through the village and the towns nearby, and eventually, people forgot about the arrogant maestro who came to visit. But they never forgot the morning the piano sang for the woman who worked the earth. And every time someone passed the Sterling estate, they would glance at the drawing room window and wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, true genius wasn't found in the palaces of the world, but in the humblest of places, waiting for the courage to speak.